The whole world has turned its eyes to the Kremlin palace. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu is being dismissed by Vladimir Putin after the Ukrainian army's operations on Russia's border. Putin, who decided to hold an emergency meeting in the Kremlin after the cross-border operations organized by the Ukrainian army, decided to dismiss Sergei Shoigu. In the past weeks, 3,000, the city of Belgorod, located on Russia's border with Ukraine, has been captured by the Ukrainian army in a cross-border operation organized by the Ukrainian army. While the Russian army continues its occupation of Ukrainian territory, the Ukrainian army's occupation of a city in Russia has caused great panic in the Kremlin palace. After this failure of the Russian army, the Ukrainian army organized an air operation against Moscow, once again demonstrating the failure of the Russian intelligence service. However, Russian leader Vladimir Putin blamed the Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, for this failure of Russian intelligence instead of the head of the Russian intelligence service, Sergei Naryshkin. Before we get into the details of the news, let us give a brief information about the two operations that led to the dismissal of Defense Minister Shoigu. In the past weeks, pro-Ukrainian soldiers serving on Russia's Belgorod border infiltrated into Russia wearing varying Russian military uniforms. Pro-Ukrainian soldiers entered the city of Belgorod, and Russia's Military Coordination Center managed to clear two important towns in Belgorod from Russian forces with the operations they organized here. This ground operation organized by the Ukrainian army made Vladimir Putin very angry. However, the event that really broke Vladimir Putin's patience was the air operation organized in Moscow. Unmanned warplanes that mobilized within the borders of Russia suddenly appeared and carried out airstrikes against some parts of Moscow. As a result of the drone attack, Vladimir Putin suffered millions of dollars in damages. Although Ukrainian government officials said they had nothing to do with these attacks on Moscow, Vladimir Putin blamed the Ukrainian army for the attack. After this attack on Moscow, things got even more complicated, and the Kremlin palace called for a meeting late at night, summoning several senior officials, including Russian General Valery Gerasimov and Defense Minister Shoigu. According to information obtained from sources close to the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin wants to dismiss Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu during this meeting and replace him with Valery Gerasimov, the Russian Chief of General Staff. Putin is angry that Russian intelligence was not informed about the airstrikes on Moscow and that the unmanned warplanes could not be destroyed before they carried out the attack. He believes that Shoigu has failed to fulfill his duties. Sergei Naryshkin, the head of Russia's intelligence service, said that they had detected the possibility of an airstrike on Moscow and that they had reported this to Defense Minister Shoigu. Putin, who was disturbed that Defense Minister Shoigu did not take any measures in this regard, threatened to dismiss Shoigu. However, Shoigu denied all these allegations and refuted the head of intelligence, Sergei Naryshkin. According to the allegations, there was a verbal argument between Shoigu and Naryshkin during the meeting. Towards the end of the meeting, it was learned that Russian leader Vladimir Putin planned to dismiss Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and replace him with Valery Gerasimov, the Russian Chief of General Staff. Putin, who was disturbed by the recent attacks within Russia's borders, thinks that General Valery Gerasimov, who has more knowledge about the army and defense, is more suitable for this task instead of Russian General Gerasimov. It is said that Russian General Sergei Surovikin, who was previously dismissed, will be brought back. According to sources close to the Kremlin, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu refused to accept that all the responsibility for the failure of the Russian army should fall on him. Shoigu, who is uncomfortable with the blame for the Russian army's failures being placed on him, said that the Russian intelligence service officers working on the territory of Ukraine failed to fulfill their duties and put all the blame on Naryshkin. It is said that Vladimir Putin will not announce the dismissal of Shoigu at this time on the grounds that the Russian people have been experiencing a very tense period recently. It is well known that Russian leader Vladimir Putin does not take any responsibility for such major failures. He does not want to take responsibility himself. Putin always finds a scapegoat. Having changed the commander of the Russian army twice before, Putin seems to be doing the same now. However, it is not yet known how the Russian people will react to such a major change, as it is known. Russian General Sergei Surovikin, who was previously the commander of the Russian army in Ukraine, was dismissed and replaced by Valery Gerasimov. However, This change did not please the Russian soldiers in Ukraine. Surovikin will gain the trust of Russian soldiers in a short time and was about to take full control of the army. Surovikin, known as a general with a criminal record, wanted to show his power by launching airstrikes against the capital Kiev immediately after taking office. The Russian soldiers, on the other hand, liked Surovikin's aggressive policy. However, Surovikin's rapid rise to power was very disturbing for Vladimir Putin. Immediately after taking office, the Russian general Surovikin sent the soldiers he had served with in Syria to Ukraine, where he created a special unit. This unit, consisting only of his own soldiers, was assigned special tasks. Over time, more and more Russian soldiers joined this unit, forming a special unit belonging to General Surovikin. However, the fact that Surovikin took full control of the Russian army began to make Putin uneasy. The people who were angry with Putin due to inflation and the economic crisis in Russia could start a major revolt. Fearing a coup, Putin suspected that Surovikin could stage such a coup. Surovikin, who gained such power in a short time, could have ended Putin's regime if he staged a coup against Putin. Fearing that this might happen, Putin dismissed Surovikin and replaced him with General Gerasimov, whom he trusted more, in order to prevent Surovikin's rapid rise to power. With the dismissal of Defense Minister Shoigu, it is said that General Gerasimov will become the defense minister. In this case, the question of who will be the Russian chief of staff is still being asked. Although the claims that Sergei Surovikin will be the chief of the general staff have increased, it is very difficult for Putin to take such a risk. While Russian leader Vladimir Putin continues to occupy Ukrainian territory on the one hand, on the other hand, he is trying to protect himself from the threats around him. Yevgeny Prigozhin, who made a deal with Vladimir Putin at the beginning of the war and sent Wagner mercenaries to Ukrainian territory, has recently started to cause a lot of trouble against Putin. Recently, Prigozhin addressed Putin from a frontline Ukrainian territory and threatened him for not sending Russian weapons and ammunition to the Wagner soldiers, stating that Wagner soldiers had to withdraw from many regions. Prigozhin said that if this continues, he will withdraw Wagner soldiers from Ukrainian territory. The Russian economy is going through a very turbulent period due to the sanctions imposed on Russia by the US and Western countries. Putin, who has difficulty in sending military shipments even to Russian troops in Ukrainian territory, cannot provide military support to Wagner soldiers in any way. Prigozhin, who was disturbed by the situation, warned Putin in a very harsh language. On the other hand, Russian oligarchs operating in Russia decide to withdraw their support for the Russian army. Russian oligarchs who could not predict that the war would last so long have been supporting the Russian army since the beginning of the war. However, many Russian oligarchs say that they have suffered billions of dollars in losses due to this war and continue to suffer even more, stating that the Russian economy will suffer a major collapse if the war continues in this way. Russian oligarchs are trying to save themselves by gradually cutting their support for Putin. As it is known, the assets of Russian oligarchs close to Putin are being seized in Europe. Many Western countries are confiscating the valuable assets of these Russian businessmen, such as yachts, boats, and cars. The tension does not decrease on the Bakhmut front line. The Ukrainian armed forces are fighting against two different military forces, both against Russian troops and against Wagner mercenaries. Despite this, Ukrainian soldiers are conducting effective counterattacks and operations on the front line in the city. Let's take a closer look at what the Ukrainian army is doing in Bakhmut, which confronted two different military forces and worked wonders here. Recently, the Ukrainians cleared a 1-kilometer trench on the northern flank of Bakhmut and recaptured a 3-kilometer zone on the southern flank of Bakhmut. This striking operation of the Ukrainian armed forces began when Prigozhin gave the news of a Ukrainian counterattack. According to the Wagner leader, the Ukrainians launched a strong counterattack south of Ivanovka the morning after the attack. The Ukrainian forces had advanced about 500 meters. After these attacks, Prigozhin was informed that the Russian 72nd Brigade left their positions as soon as they saw the Ukrainian tanks and armored vehicles. This news was given to Yevgeny Prigozhin by his own soldiers. Moreover, the Wagner leader announced that the Russian Defense Ministry had deceived him and they had cut off supplies again after the first day. Prigozhin sounded alarmed, and Wagner admitted that the group was both depleted of ammunition and that its flanks were vulnerable. Wagner leaders stated that Ukrainians will want to evaluate the situation against one another. The Ukrainian side, on the other hand, stated that everything Wagner leader Prigozhin said was true and released a striking video about Russian soldiers fleeing their positions. Russian troops were apparently demoralized by the constant fear of a possible Ukrainian offensive, and they thought that staying in the line of contact would be certain death. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense announced that the soldiers fleeing these positions consisted of both Russian army units and Wagner mercenaries. The attack which scared the Russian and Wagner forces away from the front was carried out by the soldiers of the Ukraine 3rd Assault Brigade. If you remember the soldiers who stopped the Russian advance in Kremova and carried out incredible counterattacks in that area were members of the 3rd Assault Brigade. Now, the soldiers of this brigade went on a hunt for Russian and Wagner soldiers in Bakhmut. The Ukrainians attacked the Russian trenches with their tank and armored vehicles and killed the Russian and Wagner forces that could not escape. The number of Russian soldiers killed was announced as 64 at that hour, but the number will increase as the operation is still ongoing. As a result of the operation, the Ukrainians completely destroyed the second Russian bridgehead on the west side of the flank. The Russians previously had another bridgehead next to the forest about a month ago, but the Ukrainians had eliminated it at this bridgehead. Wagner leader Prigozhin was furious with the 72nd Brigade of the Russian army who had fled. He said that his own soldiers had lost 500 men to form a strong bridgehead, and the positions there were ready. All the Russian 72 Brigade had to do was stay and defend the trenches. But within a day, the soldiers of the brigade lost half of the trenches because of the collapsing front line. The Wagner mercenaries refused to go to these positions because the Wagner forces did not want to shoulder the burden of the collapsing front due to the problems they had in the wings. The problems experienced by the Wagner forces in the city grew even more. However, for the Wagner forces, this offensive of the Ukrainian forces resulted in a very heavy casualty. After the successful Ukrainian offensive, Russian soldiers tried to enter the operation area in Bakhmut. Ukrainian forces, on the other hand, realized this situation. For this reason, the Ukrainians were expecting a big attack at night when the Russian troops attempted to make an attempt. Fortunately, the attack did not happen because a large HIMARS bombardment was carried out in Bakhmut. The bombardment was so severe that the loss of the Russians was just as heavy. The Ukrainians quickly created a shortage of resources by destroying multiple ammunition depots, troop and equipment gathering areas belonging to Russian troops. These famines likely forced the Wagner group to re-evaluate their plans and go on the defensive. Wagner troops cannot decide what to do because of the uncertainty they face, especially as they are likely to face a large-scale mechanized attack or a counter-supply operation. On the other hand, when the disagreement between the Russian mercenary group and the Russian army, which took an active role in Russia's war in Ukraine, reached a critical level for the upcoming Ukrainian offensive, Russian leader Putin was alarmed. Putin, who could not provide willpower with heavy losses and problems at the front, is having a hard time in the occupation of Ukraine. The withdrawal of the Russian army and the subsequent inability to resist the Ukrainian attacks makes Russia a fear that it may be one of its possessions, including Crimea. For many Ukrainians, his issue has understandably become partly a matter of honor and emotion. Given Ukraine's suffering as a result of the occupation, the Ukrainian people rightly want to see Russia completely defeated. The desire to restore Ukraine's territorial integrity has been the motivator and sole purpose of this war. Considering Russia's defeats and terrible losses in the war, the loss of Crimea is only a matter of time. In other words, by far the biggest threat to Russia's escalation of war with unplanned attacks comes from Ukraine's move to take Crimea. Given the risks of nuclear escalation, the reasons for U.S. support for the capture of Crimea, especially the Sevastopol naval base, which is often attacked by Ukrainian forces, is Russia's only deep-water port in the Black Sea. The loss of the peninsula would largely destroy Russia's ability to project power in the Mediterranean as well. In short, Russia's large-scale operation from the north and east of Ukraine, which started in February 2022, seems to be remembered in the history of war as an example of a major failure. On the other hand, the increased motivation of the Ukrainian troops and then the successful defense maneuvers required further steps to be taken in this direction. There are only a few days left for the great offensive aimed at clearing all Russian troops in Ukraine, including the Crimea. The military aid of the West, which will contribute to the start of the great offensive of the Ukrainians, should not be ignored. The Ukrainian army began to intensively transfer Western military equipment to the front in Ukraine. Movements of American Bradley infantry fighting vehicles advancing towards the front line are observed. It's assumed that the unit was transferred to the combat zone after the replacement of the Soviet BMP-1 with the American Bradley BMP. It is also possible for German Marder infantry fighting vehicles, American Stryker armored personnel carriers, and British Challenger 2 tanks to carry out combat coordination in the area close to the contact line. The observed movements indicate that the command of the armed forces of Ukraine sent new brigades equipped with Western armored vehicles to the front in anticipation of the expected counterattack. In addition, the Ukrainian army has once again proved that the Russian forces will not change their plans and that they will continue the offensive by doing everything possible to take Bakhmut, with the sending of Western armored vehicles to the front lines. When we look at the developments on the front, we can say that this is the meaning that emerges against the background of numerous statements from both the Russian army and officials about the start of the offensive of the Ukrainian armed forces. This is particularly worrying for Russian President Putin. In summary, the Ukrainian army, whose training, logistics, combat support, command control is complete with approximately 30 main battle tanks each. A total of 6 battalions is currently waiting and formed with the support of the West, waiting for the signal. While the support for Ukraine is coming unabated, Russian soldiers have started to raise white flags, signaling surrender. To go into the details of this conflicts that are on the agenda of the whole world, Russian forces are being defeated after the aid to Ukraine. As a result of the failed attempts of the Russian army, Ukraine has stepped into the beginning of the days of great victories. As a result of these victories, many Russian soldiers have been captured, and this situation has started to shake the world agenda, with striking videos, in particular with the emergence of embarrassing footage recorded by captured soldiers. Videos containing derogatory anti-Putin statements have also caused a great shock. One soldier's statements that it is more comfortable to be a prisoner than to be in Putin's army deepen this effect even further. Moreover, these statements reveal the harsh policies of the Russian army, and the fact that Russian soldiers are making such harsh accusations despite fighting in harsh conditions has shocked everyone. As Ukraine repeatedly repelled Russia, which was under constant attack, France mobilized in support of Ukraine. It is putting even more pressure on Russia, which has already made a big mistake. While Ukraine's strength continues to grow, France is doubling of the number of Caesar's self-propelled artillery pieces it had promised earlier has shocked and despaired Russia. The increasingly weakened Russian military has resorted to the nuclear threats as a last resort at this critical juncture. The international community was gripped by an air of great anxiety. Russia's nuclear threat is escalating tensions in the region and poses a serious threat to world peace. This situation is also affecting political balances around the world. Russia's nuclear threat has further emphasized the importance of France's support for Ukraine and has prompted other countries to step up their assistance to Ukraine. The international community has begun to unite to stop Russia's aggressive policies and protect Ukraine's territorial integrity. Ukraine, with its rich inventory of equipment, is gradually gaining the upper hand in the race for superiority over Russia, aiming to expel Russia from its territory without losing its superiority. Ukraine continues to effectively use Bayraktar TB2 drones, which it has been actively using since the beginning of the war. During this time, it is known that the Ukrainian army has significantly developed and strengthened itself. The intelligence information gathered by Bayraktar TB2 revealed a security vulnerability discovered in Russia's military bases and put Ukraine one step ahead. Using this advantage, Ukraine surrounded the Russian headquarters with remote-controlled explosives and planned to cause confusion among Russian soldiers. They achieved their goal after remotely detonating the carefully placed explosives. Panicked by the explosions, Russian soldiers went outside and tried to understand the situation. However, it took time for the Russian soldiers to realize the situation as the Ukrainian soldiers managed to avoid being caught by the spotters while planting the bombs. Russian soldiers had difficulty even finding a place to take cover, causing the wave of panic to grow. During this time, Ukrainian soldiers continued to advance towards the headquarters. As a last resort, the Russian soldiers turned to tanks. But they were in a difficult situation when Ukrainian soldiers neutralized the tanks. As the fighting continued, Russian soldiers realized that their tanks would explode and had to raise the white flag. The withdrawal of the Russian troops, which rapidly declined from the beginning of the war to the present day, clearly demonstrated that they voluntarily gave up the region. The strategic planning and effective use of Ukraine to put Russia in a difficult situation resonated widely in the international community. While these events revealed the consequences of Russia's aggressive policies, Ukraine's courage and determination are also appreciated. However, more efforts are needed to end the conflict and restore peace in the region. The reasons for the failure of the Russian army have finally come to light. Alongside the Ukrainian army, which is fighting for liberation, there is a reluctant Russian army standing together. It is known that 190,000 Russian soldiers have lost their lives so far in this war. Low motivation is observed among Russian soldiers who are forced to fight and fight reluctantly. With Ukraine gaining the upper hand, Putin is said of increasing pressure on his troops. The harsh sanctions are becoming more severe every day. Russia's troop numbers are dwindling day by day, and Russia is facing a shortage of troops like never before in its history. In particular, a unique campaign called I Want to Live has turned the tide in Ukraine's favor. The campaign was launched after the emergence of soldiers in the Russian army who preferred to be captured rather than fight, and were captured simply to avoid continuing the war. But in the framework of this campaign, the soldiers are contacted through hotlines and persuaded to surrender. The simplicity and feasibility of this practice has led many soldiers to surrender. Protests for Russian soldiers who were forcibly recruited and lost their lives also begun. However, these protests are accompanied by Kadyrov's extremely harsh rhetoric, threats that if the protests continue, he will send them to join. Those soldiers have once again revealed the deplorable state of the Russian army. In addition to these striking news, the information that Wagner neutralized the soldiers who tried to flee has caused a great resonance around the world. The people no longer wanted to be under Putin's rule in the face of NATO decisions and the popular uprising. Putin cannot hide his anger instead of alleviating his anger. International court decisions have fueled it even more. Commanders who might have attempted a coup or are being arrested one by one. The protests following all these events have driven Putin mad. In Russia, the public's reaction to the war is getting stronger and stronger every day since the beginning of the war with Ukraine. The people have reacted with great determination, and now they have started mass protests. The mass mobilization of the people for an end to the war has put the government under pressure. Anyone who has been following Russia's agenda in recent days is convinced that Putin is more ambitious to stay in power than to care about his country, and that for the first time, he is fearful of falling from power. When the team tasked with preventing public protests takes a tough stance by using force against the people, they are further enraged. While Putin's initial assurances that the war would only last for a week initially limited the backlash, Putin's failure to fulfill his promises has led to greater turmoil. The public, at a loss as to what to do in the face of erratic statements by unstable politicians, found no other option but to take to the streets in search of another solution. In addition to all this, their biggest concern has undoubtedly become the fear of losing their homeland. Ukraine sees the opportunity to use these reactions to its advantage. The Ukrainian army has turned the situation in Russia to its advantage and has been achieving great successes day by day in the regions occupied by the Russian army. The support to Ukraine has started to show its effects in every aspect. Ukraine, which has achieved great successes in every operation, does not neglect to thank every country that comes to its aid. This solidarity and assistance has increased Ukraine's motivation and contributed to a stronger resistance against the war. Day by day, Ukraine is proving its superiority in the war and gaining more and more advantages over Russia. The huge payments to the military industry have repeatedly triggered Russia's economic crisis and led to a serious economic collapse at home. Thanks you for watching us.